The village of St. Mary Mead had always seemed a most tranquil place to the casual visitor. Quaint cottages with their well-kept gardens, roses blooming round the doorways, and the distant sound of church bells on a Sunday gave the impression of a life unruffled by trouble. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple was fond of observing, human nature is the same everywhere, whether in a London flat or a country lane, and it was precisely human nature that had a way of intruding upon the seeming peace of her beloved village. The morning the news first broke, Miss Marple was tending to her delphiniums in the little patch of garden behind her ivy-clad cottage. A faint mist still clung to the fields beyond, and the air was fragrant with dew and lavender. She was stooped over, trowel in hand, when her maid, young Cherry Baker, came rushing out, her face pale with agitation. "Miss Marple, oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? There's been a terrible business up at Colonel Bantry's." Miss Marple looked up, brushing earth from her gloved hands. "A terrible business, Cherry? My dear girl, you'll have me imagining all manner of dreadful things. Best to be clear about what has happened." Cherry's voice dropped to a whisper, though there was no one about to overhear. "They say there's been a body found right there in the Colonel's library." Miss Marple's blue eyes widened just slightly, though she did not gasp nor exclaim as many might have. Instead, she regarded Cherry with that mild, thoughtful expression which masked so much keen observation. "A body in the library? Dear me, that is not the sort of thing one expects to find among the Colonel's collection of hunting prints. Indeed, Mrs. Bantry is near beside herself. The news is all over the high street already, though the police have only just come." Miss Marple straightened, her slender frame surprisingly erect for her age. She removed her gardening gloves slowly, as though considering each movement. "Well, Cherry, human nature is very much inclined to intrude in the most unlikely places. I think I should pay my respects to poor Mrs. Bantry before the house becomes positively overrun." Cherry, though eager to hear more gossip, knew better than to question her employer. Miss Marple's quiet presence at the heart of any village event was something the community had long since accepted, and so, after a quick wash and donning a neat grey coat and sensible hat, Miss Marple set off along the familiar lane that led to Gossington Hall. The Bantry residence. At Gossington Hall, the Bantrys were of the old county gentry, respected, if not universally admired. Colonel Arthur Bantry was bluff and hearty, with a fondness for shooting, hunting, and recounting tales from his army days. His wife, Dolly, was his opposite, excitable, dramatic, and somewhat prone to flights of imagination. Yet beneath her fussing, Miss Marple had always detected a good heart. As she approached the great red-bricked house, Miss Marple noticed already a small cluster of villagers lingering at the gates, whispering behind gloved hands. She passed them with a polite nod, ignoring their curious glances, and was soon admitted by the butler, a man looking distinctly ruffled for once. Mrs. Bantry met her in the drawing-room, fluttering about in a state of agitation. "Jane, my dear, you've heard, of course. Oh, it is simply too awful. The police are in the library this very moment. Arthur is all in a fuss, talking of his reputation and what people will think." Miss Marple took her friend's trembling hand. "Calm yourself, Dolly. Tell me, quietly, what exactly has occurred." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, though her eyes still shone with shock and morbid curiosity. "It was this morning, at first light. Arthur went down early, as is his habit. He rang for me in the most dreadful state. There was a girl lying dead on the library rug." "A girl?" "Yes, Jane, and the strangest thing, neither of us has the least idea who she is. Young, fair-haired, dressed in the most outrageous evening gown. She looks like a creature from one of those nightclubs in London." Miss Marple nodded gravely. A body was one thing, an unknown body was quite another, and the police, Superintendent Slack, is in charge. Oh, Jane, you know what he's like, tramping about with his men, treating Arthur as though he were a criminal. Arthur, of all people. Miss Marple's lips twitched ever so slightly. She knew well that the Colonel's bluster did not sit well with the pompous superintendent, and sparks had flown before Dot. At that moment the door opened, and in came Colonel Bantry, red-faced and indignant. "Dashed impertinence, that's what it is. My own library turned into a mortuary. Slack has no notion at all of how to conduct himself in a gentleman's house. Arthur, do control yourself," his wife implored. "Jane is here to support us." Colonel Bantry harumphed, then glanced at Miss Marple. "Ah, well, yes, good of you to come, Jane. Damned unpleasant business. No one has the faintest idea how the girl got in." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I wonder, Colonel, Might I? She let the unfinished question hang delicately in the air. The colonel gave a reluctant grunt. Yes, I suppose so. Better to have a sensible pair of eyes than Slack blundering about. Come along then. The library of Gossington Hall was a large, oak-panelled room, smelling faintly of leather bindings and pipe smoke. It was a place of hunting trophies, well-worn armchairs, and the quiet dignity of a country gentleman's retreat. Yet now, that dignity was shattered. On the rug before the great fireplace lay the figure of a young woman. She was dressed in a low-cut, shimmering satin gown of pale blue, the sort of thing that would not be seen in village society. Her fair hair was elaborately curled, her face heavily made up, though now pale in death. Her limbs were unnaturally still, one arm flung across her body as though discarded. Standing nearby, notebook in hand, was Superintendent Slack, a broad-shouldered man with a bristling mustache and a manner that suggested perpetual irritation. He looked up sharply as Miss Marple entered. "Now then, Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" "This is police business," Colonel Bantry blustered. "She's here at my invitation, Slack, and I'll thank you not to be rude." Miss Marple merely smiled gently. "I have no wish to interfere, Superintendent, but since poor Mrs. Bantry is quite overcome, I thought perhaps I might be of some quiet assistance." Slack muttered something under his breath, but turned back to his constables. Miss Marple moved closer to the body, her eyes soft yet sharp. She took in the details others might overlook: the scuff on the girl's silver dancing shoe, the faint trace of garden soil on her hem, the chipped nail varnish. "She cannot be more than 17 or 18, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else, yet dressed to appear older. A curious thing." Slack frowned. "What do you make of it then, Miss Marple? Since you're here, might as well have your say." She straightened, her expression mild. "Only that appearances are seldom what they seem, Superintendent. A young girl in an evening gown, in a gentleman's library at Dornet, is not the sort of thing that happens without a reason." Slack snorted. "Reason or no, she's dead. Likely some London floozy mixed up with bad company. We'll have her identified soon enough." But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the girl's lifeless face, and something in the set of her features stirred a memory, faint but insistent. The suspects emerged by the time Miss Marple left Gossington Hall. The whole village was abuzz. At the Blue Boar Inn, at the grocer's, even in the post office, the same question was on everyone's lips. Who was the girl in the library? As the day wore on, the investigation drew out a small cast of characters, each with their own curious link to the matter. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry themselves, of course, though Miss Marple knew well enough they were innocent of any direct wrongdoing. Still, their household and their acquaintances must come under scrutiny. Basil Blake, a young film producer recently come to live on the edge of the village, was mentioned almost immediately. A flashy young man with modern ways, he had scandalized the locals by bringing chorus girls down from London. Mrs. Conway Jefferson, a wealthy widow staying at the Majestic Hotel in the nearby seaside town of Dan, came unexpectedly into the picture when it was discovered that the dead girl resembled her adopted daughter. Ruby Keene, a dancer employed at the hotel. Mark Gaskell, Mrs. Jefferson's handsome but financially dependent, and Adelaide Jefferson, her daughter-in-law, cool and poised. Both stood to inherit substantial sums should Mrs. Jefferson alter her will. Each, in their way, would soon come under the sharp scrutiny of Miss Marple's gentle yet unerring gaze. As twilight fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her parlour fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. Cherry brought in a tray of tea, her eyes bright with speculation. "Do you think they'll find out who she was?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she adjusted her spectacles. "Oh, I think we shall know quite soon, my dear. The truth of the matter, however, may not be so easily revealed, for in every village, every family, every heart there are secrets, and secrets, as we both know, have a way of coming out in the end." The fire crackled, the night deepened, and already the quiet rhythms of village life had been disrupted by a single, shocking event: the body in the library. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a pale sun filtering through the mist that rose above the meadows of St. Mary Mead. Yet there was no sense of peace in the village. The shocking discovery at Gossington Hall had unsettled everyone, from the vicar's wife to the butcher's boy. At every doorstep the same questions echoed. Who was the girl? Why was she there? And what did it mean for the Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle shifts in village talk. Sympathy for Mrs. Bantry mingled with suspicion. After all, it was not every day that a young woman in a nightclub frock turned up dead in a country gentleman's library. One mustn't jump to conclusions, Miss Marple reflected, but human nature does have a tendency to jump quite energetically. Superintendent Slack's progress by mid-morning. Superintendent Slack was making his presence known in the High Street, stopping passers-by and demanding information, as though half the village might be hiding a London chorus girl in their attics. Miss Marple, pausing at the post office to purchase stamps, overheard him boasting to Mr. Poke, the constable. Simple enough case. Poke girls from the hotel in Danimouth, one of those dancers, no doubt, likely mixed up with that Basil Blake fellow. Mark my words, we'll have it wrapped up in no time. Miss Marple posted her letter calmly, then turned to the superintendent with her usual mildness. You are making swift progress, Superintendent. Such efficiency is most commendable. Yet if I may, do you not think it curious that a girl from Danimouth should end up in Colonel Bantry's library, rather than in the more expected locale of Mr. Blake's sitting room? Slack gave a grunt. You'd see mystery in a teapot, Miss Marple. Facts are facts. We'll have her identified before the day's out. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Yes, Superintendent, facts are indeed facts, but as I have often observed, the interpretation of them is not always so straightforward. At the Majestic Hotel by noon, word came that the dead girl had been identified. She was indeed Ruby Keene, a professional dancer employed at the Majestic Hotel in Danimouth. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, seized with a sudden resolve, insisted that Miss Marple accompany her to the seaside town. Arthur will not stir from his armchair, she declared, and I cannot bear to sit here while people whisper. Jane, we must find out what's being said at the hotel, and you always notice such little things. Thus it was that the two old friends found themselves in the ornate, if somewhat faded, lounge of the Majestic Hotel, sipping weak tea under the gaze of dusty chandelier. The place was a haunt of the wealthy, elderly, retired colonels and widows with pearls, all eager for entertainment. Ruby Keene had been their star attraction. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, bursting with nervous curiosity, leaned across the table. I dare say you will see something I should never think to look at, Jane. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One never knows. Dolly hotels are like villages. People talk, people quarrel, people fall in love, and, occasionally, people lie. One has only to listen. Their opportunity came swiftly. A well-dressed, silver-haired woman in a wheelchair was wheeled across the lounge by a nurse. Miss Bantry whispered excitedly, "That must be Mrs. Conway Jefferson, the wealthy widow. I heard she took quite a fancy to Ruby Keene." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Mrs. Jefferson's face bore the marks of sorrow and endurance. Paralyzed from a car accident years before, she had lost her husband and daughter in the same crash. Only her two children-in-law, Mark Gaskell and Adelaide Jefferson, remained close to her now. As fate would have it, Mrs. Jefferson paused near their table, exchanging polite greetings. Dolly Bantry seized the moment, introducing herself and Miss Marple. Soon they were in quiet conversation. "It is true, then," Mrs. Jefferson said gravely. "Poor Ruby, I had thought of her almost as a daughter. She was so kind, so bright, she brought a light into this place. I had even intended to provide for her, in time, and now," she broke off, visibly shaken. Miss Marple murmured gently, "You were very fond of her." "Yes, and yet how strange that she should be found in your village." "Mrs. Bantry, what possible connection could there be?" "Indeed," Dolly exclaimed, "what could she have to do with Gossington Hall?" Miss Marple, her gaze resting lightly on Mrs. Jefferson's hands, noted how tightly they clutched the armrest. She said nothing, but filed the detail away. The suspects take shape. It was not long before Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry were introduced to the others of Mrs. Jefferson's circle. Mark Gaskell, Mrs. Jefferson's son-in-law, was a striking man in his early 30s, with dark hair and a charming smile that did not quite reach his eyes. His fortune, it was whispered, had been lost in bad investments. Adelaide Jefferson, cool and statuesque, spoke little but observed much. She was Mrs. Jefferson's daughter-in-law, widow of the son who had died in the accident. Her air of aloofness concealed, Miss Marple thought, a sharp and calculating mind. Josie Turner, Ruby Keene's cousin, was the dance hostess at the hotel, a vivacious woman with quick eyes. She seemed both grieved and oddly watchful. Miss Marple detected in her manner a touch of resentment, perhaps envy at Ruby's success. Each, in their way, had reason to resent Ruby Keene to benefit from her sudden death. Miss Marple observes while Dolly chatted. Miss Marple quietly watched the interactions in the lounge. She noticed how Josie Turner spoke with the waiters in a tone of command, how Mark Gaskell's eyes lingered on Adelaide when he thought no one was looking, how Mrs. Jefferson's nurse leaned in too closely, as though guarding her employer's every word. Later, as they strolled along the promenade, Dolly burst out, "Jane, what do you think? It seems quite obvious, doesn't it? Mark Gaskell, perhaps, or Adelaide, they would lose their inheritance if Mrs. Jefferson provided for Ruby." Miss Marple's needles clicked serenely as they walked. "Possibly, Dolly. But one must remember motive is seldom so simple as money alone. I am reminded of young Tommy Bond in the village. He took apples not because he wanted them, but because he wished to vex the gardener. Human nature is quite often contrary." Dolly sighed. "You make everything sound so complicated, but I dare say you're right." Basil Blake that evening, back in St. Mary Mead. Fresh gossip was in circulation. Basil Blake, the film producer, had been arrested briefly for drunken behavior after quarreling at the Blue Boar. Slack, ever eager, declared that Blake was the obvious culprit. Miss Marple, however, was not so sure. She contrived to encounter Basil the next day, finding him lounging in his untidy cottage, surrounded by film magazines and empty bottles. He was handsome in a careless, insolent way, and greeted Miss Marple with amused disdain. "Come to scold me, have you, Miss Marple? Or to tell me I've shocked the village again?" "Neither," she replied gently, seating herself amid the clutter. "I wished only to ask whether you knew the young lady who was found in Colonel Bantry's library." Blake flushed. "I've never set eyes on her, and if Slack says otherwise, he's a fool." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "One must be careful of temper, Mr. Blake. It can so easily be mistaken for guilt. But I believe you are telling the truth. I also believe you have no wish to be further entangled in this affair. That is wise." Blake stared at her, then gave a short laugh. "You're a remarkable old lady. You know that. I'll keep out of it, as you say, but someone's been playing a very nasty game." A second discovery 2 days later. Just as the inquest into Ruby Keene's death was to begin, the village was shaken by yet another discovery. A burned-out car was found in a quarry outside Dannemont. Inside was the charred body of a young girl later identified as Pamela Reeves, a local girl guide who had been reported missing. Miss Marple, knitting set aside, listened intently as Colonel Bantry read the newspaper aloud. Pamela Reeves had last been seen accepting a lift from a man in a car. Now she, too, was dead. 2 young girls in 1 week. Dolly gasped. "Oh, Jane, what does it mean?" Miss Marple's eyes were very grave. "It means, Dolly, that whoever killed Ruby Keene is not merely wicked, but desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. We must watch very carefully indeed." The shadow over St. Mary Mead deepened. The body in the library had been only the beginning. Already, Miss Marple's mind was piecing together threads of evidence. Yet she knew the tapestry was far from complete. Somewhere among the smiling faces at the Majestic Hotel, among the whispered gossip of the village, lay the truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to find it. The inquest into the death of Ruby Keene was held at the Dannemouth Town Hall, and Miss Marple attended with Mrs. Bantry, seated discreetly near the back. The coroner, a stout man with a nonsense manner, conducted the proceedings briskly. Ruby Keene's identity was confirmed beyond doubt by her cousin, Josie Turner, who gave her evidence with outward composure, though her eyes betrayed something sharp and calculating beneath the veil of grief. "She was like a sister to me," Josie declared, her voice wavering at just the right moments. "We shared everything. I cannot imagine who could have done this to her." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved softly in her lap. She had seen many sisters in her day, real and metaphorical, and Josie's manner suggested less devotion than rivalry. Jealousy, Miss Marple reflected silently, is one of the most dangerous motives of all. The Jefferson fortune much was made at the inquest of Mrs. Conway Jefferson's intention to provide for Ruby Keene in her will. Mark Gaskell, dashing in a dark suit, gave evidence with practiced charm. He admitted that Mrs. Jefferson had grown fond of Ruby, and that such fondness might indeed have altered the terms of her estate. "Not that I begrudged her," he said smoothly. "My dear mother-in-law is free to dispose of her fortune as she pleases." Miss Marple noticed how Adelaide Jefferson, seated just behind him, pressed her lips into the faintest line at those words. She, too, stood to lose if Ruby had been adopted into the family circle. Adelaide's cool elegance could not disguise a certain steel in her glance. Afterwards, in the corridor, Mrs. Bantry whispered urgently, "Jane, it is quite obvious. Mark or Adelaide, one of them, must have done it. They had everything to lose by Ruby's presence." Miss Marple gave her friend a mild look. "Possibly, Dolly, but one must be careful. Motive is often clear enough, but means and opportunity are quite another matter. Let us not forget poor Pamela Reeves. That second death complicates matters considerably." Pamela Reeves. The case of Pamela Reeves, the girl guide, soon became the village's chief topic. She had been respectable, well liked, and above suspicion. Why should she meet such a dreadful fate? Miss Marple spent an afternoon with Pamela's mother, a weary woman who received visitors in a modest parlour smelling of lavender polish and boiled cabbage. She was a good girl. Miss Marple, always eager to help. She'd gone off that evening to meet a friend about some guide's event, and then she never came back. Did she say who she was meeting? Miss Marple asked gently. No, only that someone had offered her a lift. She was pleased, poor child, thought it was a great kindness. Miss Marple sat quietly for a long moment. I see, and kindness, alas, can sometimes conceal the darkest of motives. It was clear that Pamela's death was connected with Ruby's, though how remained murky. Miss Marple's mind worked carefully through the possibilities. A substitution, perhaps, a mistake, or had Pamela seen something she ought not? A visit to the hotel dance floor that evening. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry once more visited the majestic hotel. The ballroom, with its gilt mirrors and potted palms, had lost some of its sparkle since Ruby's absence, though Josie Turner did her best to keep the patrons entertained. From her quiet table in the corner, Miss Marple observed. Couples glided over the polished floor. The band played a tired foxtrot, and Josie moved among the guests with polished ease. Yet every so often her gaze flicked toward the entrance, as though expecting someone or fearing them. When the set ended, Miss Marple beckoned Josie over with her gentle smile. "My dear, you must be exhausted, carrying on with your duties in such trying times." Josie sighed dramatically. "It is hard, Miss Marple, very hard. Poor Ruby, she was the favorite, you know. Everyone adored her. Now I must do double the work." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "And yet, some might say, you also stand to gain. Ruby's absence leaves you unrivaled on the floor." Josie's eyes flashed for a moment before she quickly regained composure. "You are very sharp, Miss Marple. But whatever people say, I would never wish such a fate on Ruby." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, my dear, of course." A curious story. The next day brought an unexpected twist. A young maid from the hotel, Elsie Holland, came timidly to Miss Marple with a strange tale. "I don't know if it matters, miss, but the night before Ruby was found, I saw her quarrelling with Mr. Gaskell in the lounge. He was angry, said something about her being foolish, and she laughed at him. He looked dangerous." Miss Marple thanked the girl kindly. It was a useful piece of information, though one that could mislead as easily as illuminate. Lovers quarrelled often, and not all quarrels ended in murder. Yet the image of Ruby's mocking laughter lingered. Colonel Bantry under suspicion back in St. Mary Mead. Colonel Bantry was fuming. Superintendent Slack, in his usual heavy-handed manner, had allowed it to be whispered that the colonel himself might be implicated. "Scandalous," he thundered to his wife, "as though I would sneak a girl into my library and strangle her under your very nose." Mrs. Bantry, though indignant, was secretly relieved to have Miss Marple as an ally. "Jane, you must prove Arthur's innocence. You simply must. Slack is making us the laughing-stock of the county." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. "Do not distress yourself, Dolly. I have no doubt of the colonel's innocence. Slack is, as usual, looking in the wrong direction." A game of cards that evening. Miss Marple joined a small card party at the Majestic, invited by Mrs. Jefferson herself. Around the table sat Mrs. Jefferson, Mark, Adelaide, and Josie. Miss Marple knitted between hands, observing more than she played. It was Adelaide who fascinated her most. Calm, poised, she never betrayed irritation even when luck went against her. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of her mouth whenever Mrs. Jefferson spoke warmly of Ruby Keene. At one point, Mrs. Jefferson said quietly, "I had thought of making Ruby my companion in earnest, of adopting her as a daughter." The silence around the table was telling. Josie's eyes gleamed with something like triumph, as though she had long awaited this admission. Mark looked down, fiddling with his cards. Adelaide, alone, smiled faintly. though her knuckles whitened on the table edge. Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles clicking once more. It is always a joy, is it not, to find companionship in youth when one's own family has suffered so much loss. Mrs. Jefferson squeezed her hand gratefully, but Miss Marple had seen what she needed: jealousy, resentment, and fear all laid bare in that one moment. The red herrings over the following days, evidence seemed to point in several conflicting directions. Mark Gaskell, his quarrel with Ruby, his financial troubles, and his opportunity to act a perfect suspect. Adelaide Jefferson, the poised widow who stood to lose much if Ruby inherited. Her coldness concealed possible malice. Josie Turner, envy of Ruby's success and a sudden promotion to sole hostess. Did she contrive it all? Basil Blake, the village scandal, already suspected of many things, conveniently disreputable. Even Superintendent Slack grew confused, chasing one theory today and another tomorrow. "We'll get him yet," he muttered grimly, though the pronoun shifted from Blake to Gaskell to some fellow we haven't clapped eyes on yet. Miss Marple, however, was quietly certain that the truth lay in a far subtler detail. It was not simply a matter of inheritance, nor jealousy alone. There was something about the substitution of bodies, the curious death of Pamela Reeves, that gnawed at her mind. Miss Marple reflects one evening, back in her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting. The rhythmic click of needles accompanied her thoughts. 2 deaths, one girl mistaken for another, or perhaps deliberately substituted. A library chosen as the stage. Human nature, Dolly, is infinitely resourceful. One must look for the small, domestic details that betray it. Her gaze fell upon the half-knitted sock in her lap. "Yes," she murmured, "that is it. A pattern is only visible when one looks at the stitches closely. From afar, it is all confusion." She rose, her mind clear. The time was coming to gather the threads together. But first, she must watch and wait for one last piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Thus, suspicion swirled, rumors abounded, and the air at the Majestic grew thick with unease. Yet still the truth remained hidden, like a pearl within an oyster. Miss Marple, however, was patient. She knew the pearl would reveal itself soon enough, and when it did, it would shine with unmistakable clarity. The day after the inquest, Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts as brisk and sharp as the morning air. She had lain awake half the night considering the strange puzzle of the 2 dead girls. Ruby Keene, a dancer of some charm and ambition, found in Colonel Bantry's library. Pamela Reeves, a modest girl guide, burned in a car. Why should 2 such different lives end so violently, and within days of each other? Miss Marple knew one thing with certainty: the deaths were not separate tragedies. They were threads of the same pattern, interwoven by a hand both cunning and desperate. Superintendent Slack, however, was less convinced. He bustled into St. Mary Mead that morning, convinced he had at last solved the matter. Meeting Miss Marple on her garden path, he delivered his news with relish. "It's clear enough, Mark Gaskell did it. Quarrelled with Ruby, feared she'd wheedle her way into the old lady's will. So he strangled her and planted the body at Gossington Hall to throw us off the scent. As for the other girl, well, collateral damage, I suppose." Miss Marple looked at him mildly. "A neat solution, Superintendent, but does it explain why Pamela Reeves was lured into a stranger's car, dressed in Ruby Keene's frock, and then burned beyond recognition?" Slack's mustache bristled. "Details, Miss Marple, details. The broad strokes are what matter." "Yet," Miss Marple said softly, "in my experience it is the details that reveal the truth. One must look not at the picture, but at the stitches." Slack muttered darkly about interfering old women and stomped away. Miss Marple only smiled. Slack's bluster was useful. It allowed her to work unseen. A quiet conversation with Adelaide later that day. Miss Marple contrived to find herself in the lounge of the Majestic Hotel, seated beside Adelaide Jefferson. The younger woman was impeccably dressed, her composure perfect. Yet Miss Marple sensed the tension beneath the surface. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you have borne yourself with admirable dignity throughout this dreadful affair. It cannot be easy, knowing how people whisper about motives and inheritance." Adelaide's lips curved faintly. "People will always whisper, Miss Marple. It does not concern me. I have nothing to fear." Miss Marple's eyes were kind, though piercing. "No, of course not. And yet I think you are too intelligent not to have noticed something very curious. If Ruby Keene had truly become Mrs. Jefferson's adopted daughter, Then her fortune would eventually pass, not only to Ruby, but perhaps even to Ruby's chosen husband. And if such a husband were already within the family circle? Adelaide's eyes flickered, the briefest betrayal of emotion. "You mean Mark?" she said quietly, but Miss Marple inclined her head. "Merely an observation, my dear. In families, as in villages, ambitions often intertwine with affections." Adelaide said nothing more, but Miss Marple felt certain her arrow had struck home. Josie Turner's slip that evening. Miss Marple watched Josie Turner take to the dance floor, smiling brightly for the patrons. Afterward, she approached her with an air of grandmotherly concern. "You must miss Ruby very much, my dear. To lose a cousin so suddenly, it is a cruel blow." Josie gave a theatrical sigh. "Yes, Miss Poor Ruby. She was like my own sister." Miss Marple's knitting clicked. "So you said at the inquest. Yet I have often noticed that cousins, when thrown together in the same occupation, are apt to become rivals. Did you not once say that Ruby stole your best dress, Josie?" Josie froze, then laughed, a trifle too loudly. "Oh, I may have said that in jest. We quarreled sometimes, of course, but it meant nothing." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, but she noted carefully how Josie's fingers twisted the fringe of her shawl. A small detail but telling. The visit to Gossington Hall that week. Miss Marple returned to Gossington Hall under the pretense of calling upon Mrs. Bantry. In truth, she wished to look once more at the library, that the room remained much as it had been that dreadful morning. The Colonel's hunting prints, the great oak desk, the Persian rug. Miss Marple moved quietly about, her eyes keen for what others had overlooked. Near the window, she found a small smear of mud upon the sill, faint but distinct, and upon the rug, barely visible in the pile, a few strands of dark wool, quite unlike the pale blue of Ruby's dress. Miss Marple bent down, touching the threads lightly. "How curious," she murmured. "One might almost think the body had been brought here after death." And with some haste, she stood, her face serene. But within her mind the pattern was beginning to take shape. Miss Marple reflects that evening. In the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and folded her hands. 2 girls, one a dancer, one a guide, one dead of strangulation, the other burned. And why bring Ruby's body to the Bantry's library? Because it was near, because it was safe for, because someone wished to discredit the Colonel. No, because the murderer needed a stage. And murderers, Dolly, are often theatrical. She thought again of Pamela Reeves, a modest girl, yet found dressed in Ruby's frock. Why? Unless someone had intended her body to be mistaken for Ruby's. And if that was so, then Ruby must have died first. Pamela was killed to provide a substitute, to mislead Mrs. Jefferson into thinking Ruby was still alive when she had already been silenced. Miss Marple drew a deep breath. "Yes," she said aloud, "that is it, a substitution, and the one who contrived it must be very close indeed to Mrs. Jefferson. The trap is set." Miss Marple knew the time had come to act. She sought out Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, a more reasonable man than Slack, and laid before him her suspicions. Melchett listened gravely, his lined face intent. "You think Pamela Reeves was killed merely to impersonate Ruby Keene?" "Yes, she was about Ruby's age and build, dressed in Ruby's frock, burned in a car." Mrs. Jefferson would be convinced her beloved companion still lived, while in truth Ruby lay already dead. Melchett frowned. "And the motive?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled sadly. "The oldest of motives, Colonel, money and love. Mark Gaskell and Josie Turner, together, stood to gain if Ruby were removed. Mark to secure his inheritance, Josie to inherit Ruby's place as Mrs. Jefferson's protégée. Between them, they contrived a most ingenious plan. But ingenious plans have a way of unraveling under close observation." Melchett leaned back. "You are proposing, Miss Marple, that we stage a little play of our own?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her smile as mild as ever. "Sometimes the only way to catch a murderer is to allow them to betray themselves." Gathering the players the following evening, Mrs. Jefferson invited a small party to a private suite at the Majestic. Her nurse, Mark Gaskell, Adelaide, Josie Turner, and, at Miss Marple's request, the band, Colonel Melchett and Superintendent Slack were also present. Though Slack looked ill at ease at the thought of Miss Marple orchestrating matters. Mrs. Jefferson, pale but resolute, sat in her wheelchair at the head of the room. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, appeared merely an old lady come to observe. Yet it was she who guided the conversation with gentle questions, drawing out little contradictions, nudging tempers to the surface. Mark Gaskell spoke smoothly of his affection for Ruby, Josie of her grief. Adelaide sat silent, her gaze cool. At last Miss Marple set down her needles. Her eyes were very bright. It is strange, is it not, that Pamela Reeves should be found in Ruby's frock, a frock which only someone in this room could have provided. And stranger still that the murderer should choose to place Ruby's body not in some lonely spot, but in Colonel Bantry's library, where it was certain to be discovered at once. A theatrical touch, one might say, and theatricality, as I have often observed, is not in itself proof of innocence. The room grew tense. Mark shifted in his chair, Josie's fingers trembled, and even Adelaide leaned forward. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, I think we are quite ready now, Colonel Melchett." And with that she laid down her knitting and prepared to reveal the truth at last. The threads had been gathered, the pattern revealed. All that remained was to unmask the culprits, to show how each piece fitted together in the great tapestry of human folly and greed. Miss Marple, as ever, would do so with the quiet authority of one who had seen all manner of sin and folly in her village, and recognized it when it appeared in grander surroundings. The drawing-room of the Majestic was heavy with tension. Curtains drawn against the night, the lamps cast their mellow glow over gilt-framed mirrors, chintz-covered chairs, and the frail figure of Mrs. Jefferson, who sat upright in her wheelchair like a monarch on her throne. Around her gathered the players in this grim little drama. Mark Gaskell, attempting a mask of cool indifference. Josie Turner, pale but restless, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Adelaide Jefferson, erect and composed, her eyes sharp with intelligence. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, who looked simultaneously curious and uncomfortable. Superintendent Slack, puffing himself up with importance, and Colonel Melchett. But watchful. And at the very center of it, although she seemed the most unassuming of the lot, sat Miss Jane Mock, her knitting needles glinting softly in the lamplight. Miss Marple begins, my dear friends. Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying clearly across the room. We are gathered because questions remain unanswered, questions which, until they are resolved, cast a dreadful shadow over this household. 2 young women are dead, Ruby Keene and Pamela Reeves. It is my unhappy duty to tell you that their deaths are linked by a single thread of calculation and greed. She paused, looking around at each face in turn. Slack shifted impatiently, but Colonel Melchett silenced him with a glance. Let us begin with Pamela Reeves, Miss Marple continued. A country girl, modest and unsuspecting, who was lured into a motor car late one night by the promise of adventure. She never returned home. Later, her body was found in a burned-out car, dressed in a frock belonging to Ruby Keene. Why should that be? Because Pamela was meant to be mistaken for Ruby herself. It was necessary for the conspirators to give the impression that Ruby was still alive, when in fact she had already been murdered. Adelaide drew in a sharp breath. Josie's fingers clenched tighter. The motive laid bare, and why murder Ruby? Miss Marple went on softly. Because Mrs. Jefferson, in her generous affection, had begun to think of adopting Ruby as her companion and heir. To those who stood already to inherit, this was a grave threat. If Ruby were removed, the inheritance would remain secure, and if Pamela's charred body could be mistaken for Ruby's, then Mrs. Jefferson might continue in happy ignorance, believing Ruby still alive and well. She turned her clear gaze upon Mark Gaskell. You, Mr. Gaskell, had every reason to dread Ruby's advancement. With your wife dead and your fortunes waning, your only hope lay in Mrs. Jefferson's favor. Should Ruby supplant you, your prospects would vanish. And you, Miss Turner, she said, turning to Josie, were equally threatened. Ruby was younger, prettier, and already outshining you as a dancer here at the Majestic. Should she become Mrs. Jefferson's ward, your own position would be lost. You were cousins, yes, but also rivals. Josie started to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently as she spoke, the rhythm of her knitting oddly soothing against the weight of her words. It was you two together who devised the plan. Ruby must die, and Pamela must take her place. Pamela was lured with promises of excitement and evening drive, perhaps a new frock to wear. She was dressed in Ruby's gown, placed in the motor car, and burned. Ruby's body, meanwhile, was disposed of in a manner at once shocking and convenient, laid in the library of Colonel Bantry's house, where it would be discovered at once. Casting suspicion elsewhere, and ensuring that Mrs. Jefferson never doubted Ruby was alive when in truth she had already been killed. Colonel Bantry bristled. But Miss Marple raised a calming hand. You were merely a pawn, Colonel. Your library chosen for its proximity and its suitability as a stage. Murderers, as I have observed, can be astonishingly dramatic. The slip that betrayed them. Miss Marple leaned forward, her blue eyes piercing. But there are always details that betray the hand of the guilty. Josie, you spoke too eagerly of Ruby's habits, as though rehearsed. You forgot, when you declared she often wore the very frock found on Pamela, that I myself had seen it freshly altered and too small for Ruby. And you, Mr. Gaskell, you claimed to have searched for Ruby anxiously that evening, yet you gave the police directions to Pamela's village with suspicious accuracy. How should you have known she was gone there, unless you were the one who drove her? A hush fell over the room. Adelaide's face softened with a kind of grim relief. Mrs. Jefferson's hands trembled upon the arms of her chair. The confession forced Josie sprang to her feet, her composure shattering. It was Mark's idea, she cried wildly. He said Ruby would ruin everything, that she'd turn Mrs. Jefferson against us both. I only helped because you loved him. Miss Marple finished quietly. Yes, my dear, I know. It is always so. A clever woman led astray by misplaced affection. But love does not excuse murder. Mark Gaskell's mask slipped at last. His lips twisted in contempt. Old women and their gossip, he sneered. What proof have you? Words, guesses, nothing more. Colonel Melchett's voice was hard. The proof is ample. The frock, the car, the witnesses who saw you with Pamela, and Miss Marple's account explains every inconsistency. The game is over. The aftermath. Mark sagged, defeated. Josie wept into her hands. Superintendent Slack, though muttering about luck and old maid's fancies, could not disguise his astonishment. Mrs. Jefferson, her frail body trembling, looked to Miss Marple with tearful gratitude. My dear Miss Marple, I owe you more than I can say. To think that such treachery was plotted under my very roof. Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand with gentle firmness. There, my dear, you must not distress yourself further. Evil deeds will always come to light, just as weeds push their way through the prettiest of flower beds. But now the garden may be tended again. Adelaide stepped forward, her dignity unshaken. You have done us all a service, Miss Marple. My mother-in-law has been spared further deceit, and justice will be done. A quiet reflection. As the company dispersed and the accused were taken away, Miss Marple returned with the Bantrys to their quiet home at St. Mary Mead. Dolly Bantry, still wide-eyed with excitement, poured out cups of hot tea while her husband muttered about the indignity of his library being used for a corpse. But Miss Marple sipped her tea. It is extraordinary, is it not? How very ordinary human motives lie behind even the most elaborate crimes. Jealousy, ambition, greed, and one sees it all in the village. If one only pays attention, the same patterns repeat, whether in cottages or in grand hotels. Colonel Bantry grunted, unconvinced. Dolly gazed at her friend in awe. But Jane, however did you see it all so clearly? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Why, Dolly, one only has to look. A girl wearing the wrong dress, a cousin protesting too much, a gentleman too well informed, and always remembering that wickedness may wear a charming face. Once you know that, the rest follows quite naturally. She resumed her knitting. The soft click of the needles the only sound in the cosy sitting room. Outside, the night deepened over St. Mary Mead, calm once more after the storm. Closing note. And so the body in the library, which had thrown the village into turmoil, became another tale whispered over teacups, another lesson in the quiet, implacable justice of Miss Jane Marple. The Bantrys regained their peace, Mrs. Jefferson her dignity, and the world its balance. For as Miss Marple herself often said, human nature, my dear, is the same everywhere, and if one only observes it closely, there is no puzzle so dark it cannot be solved.